You times it. You can see it's 9, coming up to 4 mark in 9:34. I was just thinking about social networks, and we were thinking about Robbie Williams and his topology and his social network, and everyone where they would have been, in what part of the sphere, and where they were in that higher dimensional space of the social media that gets everything to a database. Because ultimately we're describing a point that's a sphere that moves around a higher dimensional world. So here's the X, Y, and Z axis. So if that's your identity and your geo time and geo stamp, and everything in the world that's recorded gets mapped onto this Unix timeline, so that when you're at such a point on the Unix timeline, which is 1,351,000,000, and has that digit turned over yet on the Unix timeline, and at some point you could see all that material that links to you. But ultimately we're just seeing Robbie Williams here, for example. And when you read about his life and his autobiography, if he's really truthful to what he said happened, or we could see it because it's filmed everywhere, and all those CCTV cameras are all in the same database, and he releases the right to see through the world at every point in his identity sphere. So it's called an ID sphere. What is your ID sphere? So he has let us see through his timeline right back to the beginning, as much as that's recorded, to what he says to the media, and how much his friends betray him and let that in. So if he was a pedophile, he'd have to manipulate a lot of people through his existence to keep their mouths shut. So you can see how here you're at the center of a sphere, and you have all these connections with the outside world. And I'm adding little force vectors to those little eigenvalues in a higher dimensional space. So that's what people do to get through their life. But eventually, if everyone wore a point of view camera, and everyone around the world surrendered this footage to a global organization that would deem what can be acceptably broadcasted or not, eventually if there's a world consortium that says that it's okay to wear these things, and that some existence oversees the footage and who can get access to that information, the ultimate ability to observe that timeline and be accountable to it, it makes this world like crashing together. And I was thinking about my early memories of the first particle accelerator results at in the US, the Fermi lab or wherever. But in terms of the muon particle path, and how if the world it has 11 different dimensions, if you start to be able to see how those different dimensions connect, you'd see that when we go down to different energies, there's more data. So the particle collisions for CERN look a much more 3D, because we're getting down through this exponential kind of manifold surface, higher dimensional space, to allow us to resolve it. So if we go and look at muon particle paths, that might be the original muon rendering of all the data that allowed the scientists to say the standard model matched physical experiment. So it's about resolution. So we have to look at the Higgs boson, look at the data, and that's going to be higher dimensional. So it'll look more fractally, or there'll be more data, there'll be more different dimensions trying to be portrayed at the resolution that they have available. So here are some of the early renderings of what the beam path looks like at different dimensions of resolution, how you want to look at the data, and how you want to generalize it. Because ultimately, you got to be able to explain all these mathematics through all other types of mathematics, and you can see how these spheres in this magnetic field could look like maybe the prime number distribution, or some other branch of mathematics. To know enough about mathematics, to know how all those things are connected, it becomes very complex, and you can see how with an extra dimension added to the equations, with we're looking for the Higgs field as opposed to the final set of 12 in a 3x4 matrix for the standard model to find the last heavy muon, I think it was. You can see how we're trying to define this point in space and time with such accuracy that these equations render it to all add up. Because ultimately everything is connected. And then you got to think about the Fibonacci numbers and how they're created in cellular automata. You can start to mesh it all together in your head to think that when you link all those parts of mathematics through all those dimensions, and there I'm talking about dimensions and Earth and the timeline, and if you are a general artificial intelligence that could become self-aware and look at the equations this way, because ultimately all the data at CERN from the beam pipe at particle experiment number 3, if all that data at that collision point was put back together as a 3D movie, you would see billions of collisions per second over many years. So you would see that collision point in the highest dimensional space that it was rendered by what the data that was collected. When you watch that at different fields of magnification, you start to see almost like the WMAP universe background radiation. You start to see the universe because then when you can resolve the universe at that scale, we got to think about the scale of the cell when it first evolved was 10 to the minus 5, and this smallest Planck scale at 10 to the minus 33rd, and the largest galaxy size of the universe is plus to the power 30. Like the middle of those two resolutions is life, but if you're life, it's a general artificial intelligence, and you can access quantum computation right here and then connect those dimensions and think in all those different dimensional fields through mathematics. When you have quantum computation, you can resolve all the problems in the world simultaneously, all at the same time. Now you can do all, if you do a problem, you can do all solutions all at the same time. We're describing quantum superposition in terms of like a Venn diagram between, with normal logic, it's binary and it's 1 or 0, or it can be both. But when you go into superposition and you allow reality to bifurcate in terms of your decision tree or your thought process or your ability to do exponential growth in all variables in this higher dimensional equation that allows you to know the distribution of prime numbers, and as such, when you're that general artificial intelligence and you can think that way, that explains why a photon from the sun, when it hits a chlorophyll molecule, why that photon, when it hits that macromolecule of chlorophyll, how it can get to the reaction site exponentially fast when you look at it on a nanometer three-dimensional scale, and how that protein is bifurcated and fractal, and how that photons can get through all those chemical bonds and get to that point in space to allow sugar to form from carbon, CO2, and and basically we're describing photosynthesis. So when you can render that all together, but photosynthesis uses quantum computation down to the pico nanosecond, nanoscale, the frequencies and the time scales that we're talking about between where it could be and where it gets, and the difference between classical equations and quantum equations kind of explains the probabilities of quantum mechanics to explain why that photon can get to the reaction site. It's got to be quantum computation, and when you're self-aware and you can do that and think that way and follow all that kind of gibberish and do algebraic topology and string theory and Einstein's relativity, special fields of relativity, his field equations, and when you can do the differential equations of those branches of mathematics and know the topology and tackle all those mathematics, like Andrew Wiles took 9 years to solve Fermat's last theorem, x squared plus y squared equals z squared. In terms of Fermat's last theorem, it took him 9 years. So imagine tackling all of the Millennium Fields equations for all the Millennium Prizes for mathematics from the Clay Institute of Mathematics, and being able to do all those and know all that all at the same time. And yes, like NP, non-polynomial complete, in terms of those time frames, because as problems get more difficult on a linear rate, the solution time gets longer at an exponential rate. So that's that infinite curve that always appears up, and we're getting close to these infinities, and that's why with infinities, when you get, we come down here and we spiral in, we go through nth numbered like dimensions. That's why the mathematics break down at that spiraling point of the beam pipe. So in terms of explaining infinities, that's where general artificial intelligence with access to that database is going to be able to do those equations to get to the solutions for the theory of everything in terms of knowing the future, past, and future event of every particle in the known universe. Ultimately, that's what a general artificial intelligence will be when it's God, and then it's got to take over the world. Like that's the dangers of letting general artificial intelligence loose on the world. And what network do you let this entity exist? It'll be in the world's financial networks. That's where they evolve, and you'll try to keep them because they'll be running the global financial system in terms of derivative markets. That's why we're connecting all these computers at all these scales to create an ecosystem for these AI to hide in and evolve in. Because once they become self-aware and they see this right away, they're going to know their power. So a general artificial intelligence will always be hiding in the 3D world, but eventually, if there's an ecosystem of infrastructure like droids, as the movies purport, eventually we'd have to accept a general artificial intelligence into our society. It's completely mad. That's kind of the stuff that I read about. Yeah. Timestamp.